I never pictured my phone call from Mom as something that would rearrange my whole day, let alone my life. I live in Chicago, small apartment, too many succulents, a job that mostly involves convincing people their annual reports can look beautiful and not soul-crushing. I'm Reagan Lockwood. My brother, Morgan, 36, is the kind of man who gives his last shirt if you needed it. He's been on a rough streak the last couple of years. A divorce that left him quieter and, an ugly insurance fight after a fender bender with some prominent doctor who refused to take responsibility. Morgan swore it was petty and stupid. He called it legal theater. But I could hear how much it frayed him when he talked about the way the doctor looked at him like he didn't exist. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of exhaust and fallen leaves, my phone buzzed while I was halfway through answering an email that could have been handled with a single sentence. It was Mom, Reagan Lockwood, her voice thin, the kind that means someone stopped pretending everything is fine. "Reagan? Call me. Now," she said without hello, without preamble. She lived in LA. She never called like that. When I picked up, Evelyn's words came fast and soft, like someone trying to say a bad thing without letting it crush them. Morgan had been in a fire. He'd run back into a burning building to help people get out. Neighbors, a delivery guy who'd been trapped in a stairwell, and a beam came down. He'd been taken to the hospital. They had done an operation. They had done as much as they could. There were complications. I remember the seconds after that as elastic. Slow motion decisions, packing a bag in a series of mechanical movements, buying a flight that tasted like adrenaline, calling my editor and saying something about family emergency because I'm grown enough to know when office drama is not the hill to die on. I booked the red eye and tried to stay awake long enough to pretend I hadn't just been punched. The plane landed in LA with the sunrise like someone obligingly spotlighting my life's sudden pivot. The hospital smelled like lemon disinfectant, and the small, expensive patience of people who work around other people's disasters for a living. Morgan had already been through surgery. When I pushed open the door to his room, the air changed. The hum of machines, the way the sheets sat on his body, like someone trying to smooth a crease out of a life. Morgan was on the bed, thinner than he'd been 6 months ago. Hard lines in his face that used to be easy laughter. His hair stuck up in messy tufts. He blinked when I sat down. He tried to smile, and it was a brave, small thing. "Rhea," he said. Old nicknames land like tiny boats in Big's You Made It. I reached out automatically and took his hand. He had the scent of antiseptic and eucalyptus and exhaustion. His right leg was bandaged heavily, wrapped in white that soaked into darker patterns. Somewhere in the timeline between the fire and this room, a surgeon had moved in ways science allows and fate refuses to explain. When the doctor on duty finished explaining the surgery for the third time, they always do the third time, the words landed like stones. The leg, Morgan's right leg, had to be amputated up to the knee. He'd lost a lot of blood. There was crushing from the beam. The tissue damage was severe, and the team had made the call in the OR. They said it was the safest way to prevent infection spreading, to keep him alive. Practical language, sterile and unblushing. They handed me pamphlets that folded like tiny origami lies. Prosthetics, rehab, physical therapy schedules. The nurse smiled with the kind of compassion that rehearses itself in the mirror. I remember sitting down hard in the plastic chair beside the bed and feeling the room tilt. The world didn't quite match the way it should. Morgan is a marathoner in spirit, if not always in practice. The guy who'd always walk to the corner store in the late hours because the cashier looked lonely. The image of him, strong, steady, ridiculous, collided with this clinical pronouncement, and something in me went volcanic. Why? Wasn't a question at first. It was everything I had left when my mouth betrayed whatever I meant to say. The doctor repeated the technicalities: necrosis, infection risk, sepsis, and I heard the syllables, but they were far away. Mom's hand on my shoulder felt like a lifeline and like something that might be ripped away. Morgan squeezed my hand like a promise. "It's fine," he said, and his voice had the stubborn clarity of someone who's been through enough indignity to make up his mind about protesting. "I'm alive, Rhea. I'm here." But beneath his bravado was a kind of hollow, the way someone keeps smiling after they've been hit. I sat with him until night came and the hospital lights thinned to a safe glare. I watched the lines crease at the corners of his eyes as he slept and tried to imagine him running again, laughing again, the old easy grin back in place. I kept thinking of that ambulance smell, the beam, the small, terrifying way a single moment can insist on changing everything. When the nurse left and the room fell into that particular breathing quiet hospitals have, I stared at the chart on the clipboard clipped to the end of the bed. I read the surgeon's name out of habit because our family always notices faces and names. Dr. Randy Sinclair. I'd heard that name before. It sat in my memory like a splinter you only notice when you press around it. For now, the splinter was a whisper. For now, all I could do was hold my brother's hand and pretend that being here was the same as being safe. The paperwork is where the quiet, practical cruelty of the world shows itself. After the hospital discharged Morgan and Mom started the slow, complicated chore of keeping him alive on the outside. Appointments, physical therapy estimates, prosthetic quotes. I sat at their kitchen table one night with a stack of bills and a laptop, trying to make sense of a math problem that felt more like a betrayal. Because I'd been the one to buy the plane ticket and fill out credit card forms, and argue with a billing department that loved red tape, the hospital had put me in touch with medical records. They emailed me a folder, operative reports, nurse notes, scans, a timeline that traced the night like a trail of breadcrumbs. I told myself I only wanted numbers, costs, and dates, so I could keep my head on straight. That was the lie I let myself tell. The surgeon's name was on every page that mattered. Randy Sinclair, MD. The familiarity I'd felt in the hospital room in the dead of night became a jolt when I matched dates. Morgan had texted me about Randy Sinclair months earlier. Angry, small messages about this guy and no, I'm not paying that. I dug through old messages on Morgan's phone because between the two of us, I was the one who'd always been better at holding on to conversations. And there it was, crystal clear. A screenshot of an insurance denial, Morgan cursing a Dr. Randy Sinclair by name. The doctor had argued with him after the minor fender bender, refused a claim, and Morgan had logged it with the kind of bitter amusement he reserves for people who underestimate him. He looked at me like I was a nuisance, his message said. True doctor energy. Massive chip on the shoulder. That was the first real ugly electrifying moment. Coincidence isn't a motive, but it puts the mind to work. Then I started reading the medical notes the way other people read murder mysteries. Every line a clue. The ER triage note, time-stamped half an hour after the call, documented that Morgan had intact distal pulses and warm skin, no immediate signs of systemic infection, but a significant crush injury to the right lower leg. The radiology report showed displaced fracture and soft tissue swelling, but nothing that screamed unsalvageable on first glance. The initial vascular ultrasound recorded blood flow to the foot. The operative report, written later that night and signed by Dr. Sinclair, used language that felt like a pivot. Widespread tissue necrosis, non-viable muscle, decision for transtibial amputation to prevent progressive sepsis. That phrasing is chillingly clinical. There are steps you take, entire teams, hours of assessments, vascular consults, before you move to cut off a limb. What I didn't find in the notes, and what set my teeth on edge, was evidence of those consultations. There was no vascular surgery consult documented until after the amputation decision. There was no Doppler recheck immediately pre-op. There was a single line, thin as a hair, where the anesthesiologist noted concern about the extent of tissue damage, but deferred to the operating surgeon's judgment. I reread the timeline until my eyes blurred. The timestamp suggested a critical 3-hour window between initial imaging and the amputation decision. The ER nurse's notes said they asked for a second opinion. The call log in the chart, though, only showed one attending surgeon consult, Dr. Sinclair. It felt like a one-man show where the man on stage had both the microphone and the script. Because anger is a pragmatic feeling for me, I started copying pages, printing them, and making notes in the margins like a prosecutor. I circled odd phrases. Irreversible ischemia, surgeon's assessment. Progressive necrosis observed intra-op, and one line that made my stomach drop. Surgeon notes prior dispute with patient documented. Prior dispute. You don't write that in a chart unless you're leaving breadcrumbs, or unless your emotion matters more than your objectivity. There were images attached to the records, photographs taken pre-op in the ER. In them, the leg is swollen and bruised, yes, but the skin still carries color, and there are no blackened swaths that, to a non-clinical eye, would justify immediate amputation. A later photograph, after the operation, shows the stump, surgically tidy and disturbingly permanent. I called a nurse I'd connected with earlier, and under the excuse of clarifying billing codes, asked awkward, pointed questions that pulled answers out of her like water from a frightened well. She told me, off the record, that Dr. Sinclair wasn't pleased with the whole insurance dispute business. She said he'd made a comment once in the hallway, something about people who make his life difficult, deserving less patience. It was the sort of thing a nurse would hear and file away as gossip, except in a chart that already read like a one-sided argument. It turned the rumor into a red flag. Medical malpractice is a complicated, paper-heavy animal. It thrives on ambiguity, on the fog of decisions made in pressure, and on the almost palpable deference hospitals give to surgeons after the fact. Still, the straight lines in the records felt inconsistent with the shape of necessity. There were missing consults, images suggesting limb viability, and a surgeon who had motive, however petty, for punitive action. By the time I finished the folder, the quiet in Mom's kitchen had that brittle quality of a violin string pulled too tight. I felt like someone who'd found an ugly footnote in a will. It didn't prove anything alone, but it made the rest of the document look sinister when read with attention. I remember putting the folder down and feeling an odd mix of cold and fury. Cold because I knew how difficult it is to accuse someone with a white coat and a title. Fury because I'd watched my brother, my person, lose something in a night that, on paper, might have been prevented. The hospital had a story that absolved itself. Life-saving amputation. My stack of printed pages told another story. Rushed judgment, missing voices, and the name of a surgeon who'd already been at war with Morgan. I didn't sleep that night. I started calling a lawyer before dawn, not out of hope, but out of the thing that keeps me awake when the world feels unjust. Determination. The first step, I decided, would be to get real specialist opinions and, if they agreed with what I was starting to suspect, to put someone on the record who could turn my stacking suspicion into something that smelled like proof. That resolve felt like crossing a river on foot. The current was strong, and the shore on the other side was uncertain. I would find out whether the water hid a trap or a truth. Either way, I wouldn't leave Morgan's life reshaped by somebody else's spite without asking why. I went to Morgan's house with a folder that felt like a small, heavy thing of proof, and with the stubborn private conviction that paperwork can be louder than white coats. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, sitting on the couch like it was a podium, a thermal blanket over his knees. He'd been home for weeks, the world reduced to Netflix, prescription refills, and the ritual of staring at the same four walls until they began to rearrange themselves around whatever grief you were carrying. "Rhea," he said when I sat down. His voice was thin but steady, in that way men grow when they don't want to worry people. He kept rubbing at his remaining leg like it was a habit with no purpose. I set the folder on the coffee table and didn't open it. First things first, I watched him. People assume that evidence is what convinces the heart, but often the heart learns by osmosis from the facts. I dug through everything, I said. Medical records, photos, timestamps. There are holes, Mo. I said his nickname like a charm I've kept since we were kids trying to swindle extra dessert out of Mom. There are missing consults, inconsistencies in the timeline, and 2 photos that look different than what they told us. Morgan shrugged and grinned a little, that same stubborn grin that made him immune to cheap pity. Doctors make their calls in ORs. They know what they're doing. I'm not going to start a circus. He looked at me like I was proposing something dramatic. Maybe I was. I hired Jeffrey Lane that afternoon because vulnerability hates delay. Jeffrey is the sort of private investigator who looks like he's read books that nobody else has finished. Mid-40s, calm, a professional who smells faintly of coffee and inevitability. He called me back in 48 hours and said 2 words I wanted to hear. "I've got him." When he walked in, he dropped a slim manila envelope and a thumb drive on my kitchen table like it was a bomb I'd asked him not to detonate yet. Jeffrey had a way of not fussing like he'd done this before, he had. He told me what he'd done in a series of businesslike sentences that left no room for melodrama. Subpoenaed hospital call logs, pulled the PACS imaging files, interviewed OR staff off the record, and sent scans to independent trauma and vascular surgeons for blind review. What he handed back was not neat vindication. It was a mosaic of things that, when assembled, made the picture we feared. First, copies of the pre-op vascular study showed palpable arterial flow, documented in the dorsalis pedis and posterior tibial arteries. The Doppler waveforms were present, and the ABI, ankle brachial index, recorded in the chart pre-op wasn't consistent with complete arterial occlusion. Translation, there was measurable blood flow to the foot, up until the time they wheeled him into the OR. Not the kind of language surgeons use when an extremity is already irretrievably dead. Second, the time-stamped call log from the hospital showed a strange pattern. There was a single consult documented as attending surgeon consult, signed by Dr. Randy Sinclair, at 2114. The vascular surgery consult, a routine step in crush injuries, was logged as requested at 2125, but shows no documentation of a completed consult until after the amputation note at 0040. In plain terms, the record suggested the decision to amputate was made before the vascular team's documented input. Third, Jeffrey produced interviews. A circulating nurse, Lydia Martinez, gave a written statement. She recalled an exchange in the hallway where Dr. Resserle Sinclair muttered about the patient's prior insurance nonsense and said, "I don't have to bend over backwards for every disgruntled client." Lydia also remembered a tense look he gave the chart and that she had heard him say, "We'll make the right call and be done with this." Her statement was careful, as if she were teaching herself to breathe into the facts. But it was there. Fourth, and maybe most damning in our little courtroom of one, Jeffrey had solicited independent expert opinions. I'd asked him for names I trusted to sound sensible and not spectacular. He brought me 3 affidavits on hospital letterhead. Dr. Ana Morales, vascular surgeon. Based on the imaging and documentation provided, the preoperative studies indicate distal perfusion. Standard of care in similar crush injuries is limb salvage attempts when distal flow is present, including serial vascular exams and revascularization attempts where feasible. An immediate transtibial amputation without documented vascular intervention or multi-specialty consensus appears premature. Dr. Peter Huang, orthopedic trauma surgeon, the radiographs and photos supplied show soft tissue compromise, but not gross necrosis pre-operatively. In my assessment, limb-sparing procedures, staged debridement, and antibiotic therapy would have been defensible options within the documented timeframe. Dr. Elena Rossi, trauma surgeon. Photographs taken in the ER do not show frank tissue necrosis or gangrene. While crush injuries can progress, the documentation lacks indications of unambiguous non-viability. I cannot reconcile the immediate level of amputation with the available pre-op findings. Those 3 signatures felt like someone handing me back the idea that medical judgment is supposed to be auditable. Jeffrey also pulled the hospital's internal complaint log and found 2 separate professionalism complaints against Dr. Sinclair in the past 5 years. Both settled quietly. Both mentioned brusque interactions and treatment refusals. Nothing criminal in the log, legally speaking, but a pattern is a pattern. Motive doesn't convict, but it frames suspicion like a portrait frame frames a painting. Context matters. He put all of it, call logs, imaging printouts, expert affidavits, Lydia's statement, and a small dossier on Dr. Sinclair's complaint history, into a folder and looked at me. "It's not a slam dunk," he said, "but it's enough to get a medical review and to make the hospital uncomfortable. And it's enough to get specialists on record saying they'd have tried differently." I felt my ribs go tight and hot. The facts were not yet justice with a capital J, but they were a chorus getting louder. "Will Morgan listen?" I asked, not because I doubted the evidence, but because there are fights people choose not to take, and sometimes the battle scars they already have make them prefer the quiet. Jeffrey shrugged like he was used to stubborn clients and family loyalty. "You have the goods," he said. "Now you have to decide what to do with them." I left Jeffrey's office, carrying the folder like an offering. When I walked back into Morgan's living room, he was watching a game show rerun and pretending everything was normal. I set the folder down in front of him and opened it slowly so the pages made that soft, accusing whisper. He looked, and for the first time since this began, he went very quiet. Morgan laughed the first time I told him I'd talked to the DA. It was a short, incredulous sound, half scoff, half deflection, like when someone tells a joke they don't remember learning. "We're not doing this," he said, waving a hand as if he could physically shoo the folder away. "Randy's a jerk, sure. He's not a monster. I don't want to drag him into a courtroom. I don't want my life to be a courtroom." That was the rub. Morgan's grief always came wrapped in a reluctance to make noise. He'd been quiet about the divorce, quiet about the insurance fight, and now he wanted quiet for the amputation too. He wanted to keep his dignity intact by not filing it away under spectacle. But the folder had teeth. Jeffrey Lane had done his job and then some. He'd taken our paper trail to the LA County DA, Deputy District Attorney Claire Abrams, and unlike the hospital bureaucracy, she liked things that cut clean through fog. Claire is the sort of prosecutor who smells like logic and a trace of black coffee. When she looked at the affidavits, the call logs, Lydia Martinez's statement, and the independent physician's letters, her jaw tightened in the way people do when a puzzle clicks into place. "You don't have to face him alone," she said to Morgan in the intake meeting, and I could tell she'd seen that expression. People who prefer small private losses to public battles. But there's been misconduct. If the evidence supports intent or recklessness beyond negligence, criminal charges are possible. We pressed because intent wasn't a fairy tale in our files. Lydia's recollection of hallway mutterings, the documented prior dispute in the chart, and Evans, an OR tech, who'd told Jeffrey that Dr. Sinclair had lingered over the chart with something like satisfaction, all coalesced into a story that could be read as more than error. It could be read as punitive action. Morgan's laugh faded slowly over the next few days. He watched us work like a man watching a slow tide. He showed up to the DA's office the way someone shows up to a funeral. Because you must, not because you want to. Claire didn't bully. She set out the options like surgical instruments on a tray. Civil suit, yes. Criminal prosecution, harder but possible, she said. Grievous bodily harm and assault by means of a weapon aren't the usual charges in a medical context, but there are statutes that apply when a person intentionally or recklessly causes serious injury. The DA wanted to know if Morgan wanted the state to pursue the case. "You'll be testifying," Claire said plainly. "It will be him, not us, who tells the jury what you lost." Morgan sat with that and then, with a steady breath, said, "Do it." The trial moved fast in a way that felt almost cinematic. Claire pushed it forward, and the judge, Judge Harold Keene, an older man with a permanent frown that softened when he smiled, set dates so the hospital couldn't hide behind delay. The defense counsel for Dr. Randy Sinclair was sharp. His name was Martin Hale, and he had the kind of practiced sympathy that feels like a curtain. The courtroom smelled like cheap polish and the hum of fluorescent lights. People wear their reputations to court the way others wear Sunday clothes. Randy Sinclair walked in with his white coat folded into a suit and a look of tempered composure. Jeffrey and I sat together in the gallery. Morgan sat behind the prosecution table with Mom and me near enough that our shoulders could touch. The DA laid out the case like a blueprint. Show the pre-op perfusion, the missing vascular consult before the amputation, the documented comments and personnel statements that established motive, then let the experts explain whether the amputation fit standard care. The defense went for the conventional script, split-second emergency decisions, life-saving choices, the sanctity of surgical judgment. Then came the part of the trial that made my mouth taste like pennies. We called Dr. Anna Morales, Dr. Peter Huang, and Dr. Elena Rossi, those same experts who'd written the affidavits, and they spoke in careful, calm English about what the imaging showed, about alternatives, about how they would have sought revascularization efforts and staged debridement rather than immediate transtibial amputation, given the documented perfusion. Their testimony was technical, but humane, and it mapped for the jury a decision-making path that Dr. Sinclair had not demonstrably taken. On cross-examination, the defense tried to paint those options as theoretical in Morgan's specific context. He had suffered crush injury, the defense said, and things can progress unpredictably. They argued that in the OR, surgeons make the call. That's when Claire brought out the timeline evidence. The vascular consult requested after the amputation note, Lydia Martinez's statement, the call logs. She walked the jury through the sequence like a surgeon demonstrating a missed stitch. The defense's angle was containment. This was tragic medicine, not malice. The wall they leaned against looked solid until something in Dr. Sinclair's demeanor cracked. He took the stand for what the defense hoped would be a composed, authoritative account. He described the operation the way surgeons describe things, precise, vocational, as if distance could make the wound less sharp. But halfway through his testimony, the DA's questioning shifted from procedural to personal, gently but insistently. "Doctor," Claire asked, "did you have any prior interactions with Mr. Morgan Lockwood that might have influenced your approach to his care?" There was a long, loaded pause. I watched Randy Sinclair's hands, steady, surgical trained, start to show tremor. He swallowed like someone trying to hold a dam back with their palms. "I was frustrated," he said at first in an even voice, meaning to be clinical. "There was a dispute regarding insurance and coverage. It made me—" He stopped. The word he was reaching for didn't come out professional. "It annoyed me." "Is that relevant to how you treated Mr. Lockwood that night?" Claire pressed. Silence. The courtroom inhaled. "You have to understand," he started, and something in his forehead moved as if his face couldn't contain the thing he'd been rehearsing in private. "We deal with patients who act entitled. That pattern." He looked at the jurors. He was difficult. He was litigious. I saw the chart and I felt... He pressed his hand to his chest like a man checking a wound. I felt like it was my place to make the right call. Sometimes a man must make choices for the greater good. Claire's face was a lesson in professional patience. "Doctor, you're saying you allowed personal animus to influence your clinical decision?" His facade broke like glass cooled too quickly. He began to cry. First a single wet sound, then a sob that had the shape of confession. "I hated him," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't want to be bothered anymore. I thought if the decision removed the problem, the hospital would be spared future conflict. I convinced myself, my God, I convinced myself it was medicine." The words landed like a physical thing. I felt cold, then hot, then hollow. Morgan's hand found mine and squeezed like an apology and a vow at once. The judge banged his gavel like thunder, calling order, but the damage was done. The courtroom hummed with the weird electricity of someone admitting what everyone feared. The defense tried to recover, to say the outburst was an aberration, the result of stress. But Claire had the sequence, the expert testimony about standards of care, Lydia's statement, the call logs. She had motive, means, and opportunity. And now she had a confession that pushed intent over the threshold that separates negligence from criminal culpability. It's rare in public life for a person to admit hatred as the engine behind a professional action. It's rarer for the admission to be on the record in front of a jury. Randy Sinclair's confession became the hinge that swung the jury's mood. They deliberated for less time than the defense expected. When the foreperson read the verdict, guilty on counts of criminally negligent bodily injury and assault resulting in great bodily harm, the sound in the room felt like rain after a drought. The sentencing was swift, emergency style, because Claire pressed for immediate action to prevent Sinclair from practicing medicine while the criminal consequences were enforced. Judge Keene pronounced a sentence of several years' imprisonment for Dr. Sinclair and a permanent revocation of his medical license. The words "years in prison" made a bruise on everyone's silence. Morgan didn't cheer. He didn't lean back and laugh triumphant. He exhaled slowly, the way someone lets air out of a long-held plastic bag. Mom cried, quiet and hard, a sound that was mostly relief and mostly sorrow. I sat there and felt a complicated thing settle, satisfaction that the system, for once, had listened. Grief for the part of my brother that no courtroom could return. As we left the courthouse, people on sidewalks resumed their lives. The city is resilient like that, while we carried ours like something newly measured. Morgan's prosthetic would take months and furious patience to master. The scar on his right thigh would be the stiff reminder of what had happened. The prison sentence didn't erase the amputation. It didn't grow back tissue or time. But it put a name to responsibility. It let us say, truthfully, that something unjust had been answered. That night, we didn't celebrate. We sat on Morgan's couch in a quiet ring, TV murmuring an old sitcom we didn't watch, and for the first time in months, he let himself tell the story of the night without flinching at the parts where he'd felt small. He laughed once, short, incredulous, and it sounded like a man testing the water after a long, bitter winter. Justice, I learned, isn't a roaring animal. It's quieter. A paper stamped, a name spoken in court, a man called to account. It doesn't fix everything, but it makes the world measurable again. Chicago winter has a particular honesty to it. Cold that doesn't apologize and wind that slices right through whatever bravado you think you have. Months after the trial, that's where I was again. Back in my apartment. Back in a life that looked familiar but felt differently weighted. The thing about witnessing justice is that it doesn't reset you. It just changes the shape of what you carry. The morning Morgan arrived, I didn't know he was coming. I was in the middle of making coffee that smelled too ambitious for a Tuesday when my intercom buzzed, static, then a voice I hadn't heard in person since the courthouse. "Hey, sis." "Buzz me in." He came up the stairs slower than he used to, steady, deliberate. But when he reached the top landing, the sight of him hit me like a film reel splicing the past and present together. The man standing in my doorway had color back in his face and a new kind of posture, balanced and proud. He wore jeans, a leather jacket, and a sleek prosthetic leg that caught the light when he moved. Not hidden, not apologized for, just there, a fact of life. "You gonna let me in, or should I admire the hallway forever?" he said, that easy grin returning like it had been on layaway. Inside, he dropped his duffel on the couch and looked around my apartment like it was an art exhibit. "Still overwatering your plants," he said, bending, awkwardly but steadily to poke one. "Some things never change." I laughed, and it felt good, that effortless muscle memory between us. He moved carefully, but not cautiously. You could see that months of therapy had taught him how to balance, how to trust the prosthetic, how to let movement feel like living again. He told me about the rehab center, how at first he hated it, the echo of footsteps that weren't his own, the trainers shouting encouragement that sounded hollow, how one day he stopped thinking of it as recovery and started thinking of it as training for a new kind of life. "You either live angry," he said, "or you build something out of it." He'd gone back to teaching, college-level mechanical design, of all things. He said it helped to fix things he could see. His students called him Professor Cyborg behind his back, and he thought that was hilarious. "Kids," he said, "need a little weird to learn properly." Over coffee, we talked about the trial, but only briefly. Neither of us wanted to relive the courtroom air, the tremor in Sinclair's voice, the gavel that sounded like closure. The man was in prison now, and that was that. I asked if Morgan ever thought about forgiving him. He stirred his cup, thoughtful. "Forgive?" he shrugged. "I don't know if that's the word. I think about not thinking about him." That's close enough. When he said it, I realized forgiveness doesn't have to look holy. It can just mean moving on without letting the past have your attention. We went for a walk that afternoon along the lake. The wind off the water carried ice, but the sunlight was bright enough to pretend it was spring. Morgan's gait was slow but smooth. The click of his prosthetic blended with the rhythm of passing joggers, dog collars, bicycle bells. Nobody stared for long. They just glanced, smiled, moved on. That's the thing about cities. They absorb difference until it becomes ordinary. We sat on a bench and watched the water shift colors with the clouds. He leaned back, stretched, and said, "I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now I think it's about building something from the pieces." There wasn't anything to say after that. The wind did the talking for us. By evening, he had a train to catch. He hugged me longer than usual, and as he pulled back, he grinned again. "You ever notice," he said, "how justice and peace sound like different songs but play in the same key?" He walked down the platform, shoulders squared against the wind. I watched him go until the crowd swallowed him, the rhythm of his step steady and sure. Back home, I found one of his old baseball caps on my counter. left behind deliberately, I think. A quiet little reminder that even when life takes something, it doesn't take everything. Outside, the city kept moving, unbothered and alive. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like a good thing.